The Senate just passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. The House looks to be ready to approve it, and President Biden is set to sign it into law. We can all certainly disagree on the bill's merits and argue that it either goes too far or just doesn't go far enough. But before we can do that with any seriousness, it's worth understanding just how big $1.9 trillion is. And boy, is that difficult for us to do. Virtually no one interacts with numbers of that size in their daily lives. For most people, the biggest numbers they deal with are in the hundreds of thousands when they buy a home. And even that happens incredibly infrequently. The reality is that we as humans are absolutely terrible at thinking about very big numbers like 1.9 trillion. We just don't have the mental hardware to put that number into any kind of meaningful context. Welcome to Data Demystified. I'm Jeff Gallick, and in this episode, I'm going to try to do what is so naturally hard for all of us. Put a big number like 1.9 trillion into some kind of context. If we do that, only then can we start to really have an informed discussion about the size of such a new piece of legislation. So let's jump in and start with the fact that 1.9 trillion is a huge number, like really, really big. If you lined up that much money in $20 bills, you'd have a line so long that you'd wrap it around the entire planet about 7,400 times. That sounds like a lot, but that still doesn't help us understand what 1.9 trillion means. Well, what about something a bit more tangible? $1.9 trillion could buy about 21,000 jumbo jets, or 5.7 million new houses, or 50 million new cars. All of that might be true, but it still doesn't really help us understand this number in any kind of context. None of us will ever buy thousands of jets or millions of houses and cars. So, what if instead we divide the 1.9 trillion among all Americans? Well, there are 331 million American citizens, and if we divide up 1.9 trillion among all of them, each would get about $5,700. That's a bit more manageable. We can say that the cost of this bill is about $5,700 per person. That's a number we can understand, but in this case, that wouldn't be a very useful way to think about this stimulus bill, because it's not like every person in the US is writing a check for $5,700. The key to understanding giant numbers like this isn't to consider them in different units of measurements, like houses purchased, but rather to understand them in relation to other large numbers in the same general context. For instance, the US spent about $4.4 trillion in 2020. None of us can really internalize what that absolutely gigantic number means, but we sure can compare it to the stimulus bill of $1.9 trillion. In this case, the stimulus bill is about 43% the size of what the US federal government spent last year. But is that a lot or a little? Well, we still can't make that judgment because the way this type of stimulus bill works is that the government actually borrows most of the money in order to spend it. They do that by issuing debt. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how treasury bills work, but the short version is that someone else, mostly American citizens in one form or another, give money to the government in exchange for interest payments. So we might want to consider how much 1.9 trillion is relative to what debt the country already has. Well, as of 2020, US debt totaled about $21 trillion. So 1.9 trillion is adding about 9% more to our debt. That's not something to sneeze at, but it does make 1.9 trillion, an otherwise giant number, feel a bit smaller. But even this doesn't give us the whole story, because the government actually doesn't have to pay 1.9 trillion back right away. But before we unpack that, if you could take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and click that little bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new content that I put out, I'd really appreciate it. With that said, let's look at what the government will actually owe each year once this stimulus bill is passed. Well, the government doesn't pay back $1.9 trillion in one shot. Instead, they only pay the interest on it until the loan to those who own the debt, again mostly Americans, comes due. That's what we call the interest payment. And right now, the 10-year Treasury note pays about 1.5% annual interest, which works out to $28.5 billion per year. In 2019, the federal government paid $390 billion in interest payments on other debt, so adding $28.5 billion each year increases the annual interest expense by about 7%. But is that a lot? Well, again, we can put that into a bit more context by looking at total federal government spending. In 2019, the US federal government spent $1 trillion on Social Security, which is 35 times more than the increase in annual interest expense that this stimulus bill will impose. It spent $658 billion just on the Department of Defense, which is about 23 times more than the annual interest payment. In fact, you'd have to go all the way down to the budget of the State Department, one of the smaller federal agencies, to get down to the annual cost of this stimulus bill. By no means am I suggesting that the cost is negligible, but to understand the actual size of the cost, we need to understand it in context. One other way to think about this is to say that the annual expense is on a per-person basis. $28 billion, the annual interest expense that the government will have to pay to make this bill viable, is just about $86 per American citizen. Again, I'm not trying to say that this is a small amount of money, but when we are considering any large numbers, be they government budgets or anything else, it's easy to get lost in the size of the number itself without appreciating the context that the number lives in. The stated hope is that this bill will help lots of people and stimulate the economy enough to more than make up for the added interest expense that the government is going to have to pay. We can have different predictions for this, to be sure, but at least now we can agree what the size of the stimulus actually means in context. Finally, as always, thanks so much for watching.